Conversations which are dominated by material things, which don't then elevate to a higher level, to the world of ideas and what could be and what should be, is a very primitive level of conversation. After the first stage of initial shock, Frankel now tells us that the prisoner went through the second stage, which he refers to as a phase of relative apathy, in which the inmates experienced a kind of emotional death. What does he mean here? He means that the prisoner then began to kill any emotion that he went through and became almost passive to everything that was going on around him. Why? Well, Frankel gives us two reasons. The first reason is that the prisoner had this constant longing for the life that he had and what he had left behind. And there was this constant longing that had to be deadened after some time, where you don't think about your past life because it was too painful. And please, you always have to remember when you're reading this that these were people who were like you and me. One day we are living in a normal environment, food, shelter, clothing, clean, everything. And then suddenly you're thrown into this brutal and very ugly condition where you're treated very badly. And then on top of that, there's no sewage system. So Frankel now talks about an experience where a person was dragging a bucket of excrement, and the excrement splashes on his face, and obviously the person, makes a face of disgust. And the capos, the soldiers who are looking after them, the capos hits them for expressing this very natural reaction. And so slowly by slowly, then the prisoner had to sort of deaden their face and not show any emotion. And so slowly by slowly, that's when now they reach this stage of an emotional death, of apathy. And what did this look like? Well, Frankel uses himself as an example. He says that there's a moment in time when there was a prisoner who died. And he called the nurse, who really was one of the other prisoners, to come and take away this man who was dead. And the man, of course, is very weak because they didn't have any food. They were never given enough food. So the man drags the dead person, the dead body, through the place where they're staying, and then takes it down the stairs, and you can hear the head of the person hitting the ground. Boom, boom, boom. And then he drags him a bit of distance away and leaves him there. And even though he had been speaking to this man 2 hours before, he was passive to this and watched him. Therefore, Frankel now tells us that the disgust, horror, and pity were emotions that they could not feel anymore, that they were not allowed to feel anymore when they were in the camps. They had to retreat into now what he's calling apathy. He says, apathy, the blunting of the emotions and the feeling that one could not care anymore, were the symptoms arising during the second stage of the prisoner's psychological reactions, and which eventually made him insensitive to daily and hourly beatings. By means of this insensibility, the prisoner soon surrounded himself with a very necessary protective shell. I was reflecting on this idea of apathy as a necessary protective shell. And three scenarios came to mind. The first scenario was about the young people that we may have in our life, our children, where after a long time when they can't seem to find any meaning in their life, or they get tired of us speaking at them, you reach a point where they're looking at you as you're talking to them, but They don't seem to care anymore. They're just listening to you, but very passive. The same thing you've noticed among students as well when they're failing in school and you can't seem to get through to them. Again, it's like they cannot find any more connection with their studies or with their life out there. And when you talk to them or you try to connect with them, there's that deadpan reaction. And the third scenario is what many of us experienced when they were talking about the quiet quitting, where people come to work, they do their job, but there's no emotional connection to your work anymore. You have quietly quit. And so, of course, in all of these scenarios, it's important that people reconnect and find meaning in whatever it is that they're doing. And now, owing to this apathy, the inmate then went through a mental regression, a more primitive form of mental life, whereby their interest now was primarily on food. Their dreams were about food, their conversations were about food. How best to save the bread that they were going to eat. Do you eat it immediately or do you stagger it out during the day? And this primitive life, only thinking about how to get food and how to save one's skin, killed all sentimentality on the part of the prisoner. Of course, at this point, one may ask themselves, but what is wrong? Why is always talking about food? Why is Frankel calling that a primitive mental life? It's because we are made for bigger things. We are made to speak about ideas and to engage with the world of ideas, not to be talking about all the time the latest cars that we have, the clothes, how much money we make, the restaurants where we ate, what kind of food we ate, body shapes and body parts. As Aristotle says, to be always seeking after the useful does not become free and exalted souls. Conversations which are dominated by material things, which don't then elevate to a higher level, to the world of ideas and what could be and what should be, is a very primitive level of conversation. Frankel tells us, in spite of all the enforced physical and mental primitiveness of the life in the concentration camp, it was possible to have a deeper spiritual life. And here, when he's talking about spiritual life, he's not only talking about spiritual in terms of religion and God, he is talking also about an inner life. The external conditions did not prevent them from leading to contemplation. That's inward thinking. And Frankel gives us an example. He says that one morning they were walking through the snow. It was cold and very uncomfortable. And his friend turns to him and whispers to him, wow, if only our wives would see us now. And this sets Frankel to start thinking about his wife. And he thinks about looking at her. And then he goes deeper and starts having a conversation with her. He talks to her, she answers back. He talks to her, she answers back. And like this, he retreated into an inner life. He imagined her watching him, answering him. He imagined them walking. And slowly, in this process of doing that, he falls deeper in love. Now, contemplating his wife, feeling the love that he has for her, thinking about this love, removed him from the conditions where he was at that point in time. Yes, he's walking through the snow and he's digging and there's all this ugliness around him. But in thinking about his wife, it removed him and takes him to another place, which then made the conditions where he was much more bearable. And that's when Frankel says that he discovered the idea of a redeeming love. I understood how a man who has nothing left in this world still may know bliss, be it only for a brief moment in the contemplation of his beloved, In a position of utter desolation, when a man cannot express himself in a positive action, when his only achievement may consist in enduring his sufferings in the right way, an honorable way, in such a position, a man can, through loving contemplation of the image he carries of his beloved, achieve full fulfillment. And this act of contemplation, of thinking about his love, having the conversation with her, coming to the conclusion that he now wants to behave honorably, this is what we refer to when we talk about an inner life. That there's this physical life that is going on, but inside there's also something else that is going on in the human being. And this inner life is what then gives meaning to the actions that the person is taking. In the case of Frankel, the love of his wife makes him want to act more honorable, to endure his sufferings in an honorable way. Which, of course, then leads us to ask the question, what kind of an inner life do you and I have? What are the thoughts that dominate my inner life? And if our inner life is very base, what's the next meal? The latest gossip. If it's very base, then that means that those actions that we're taking from moment to moment, day to day, will also be very base. However, if our thoughts are honorable, if our thoughts are contemplations, are thinking of higher things, then necessarily our actions will then follow. In a practical way, what would these higher conversations look like as we're trying to discuss and propose here? Let's use the example of the one thing that is dominating our lives right now, which is AI and the impact that it's going to have on our lives. It would be interesting then if we would elevate that conversation to then ask ourselves, what is the difference between an AI and a human being? Which would then center the conversation to what makes a human being. What's the difference between a human being and a machine? That question about what is a human being, what makes a human being different from a machine, is a very important one. And if one even just starts a conversation and a set of readings from this, it will lead you down a very interesting path. And this perhaps can be the beginning of what will be your great conversation with your friends and with your colleagues, what a human being is. Next week, we continue the conversation about cultivating an inner life and how by finding this inner life and working at it, Frankel then found meaning and a purpose for his existence in the concentration camp.